Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, President Kennedy takes in a ball game. In Georgia, Dr. King goes to jail. At Cape Canaveral, Telstar is launched into orbit. Khrushchev talks tough, McNamara sees progress, and the U.S. sets off a nuclear blast on the fringes of outer space. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Rambler's Weekend Special will do the trick. You'll save on any model you happen to pick. On sedans, and wagons, and convertibles too. On V8s and 6s, and E62. Drop in Friday night. Saturday too. Your Rambler dealer's got big savings for you. And compromise. Let her pick the color.
President Kennedy joined a crowd of 45,480 today at Washington's new D.C. Stadium to observe the first of 1962's two All-Star games. Just before Mr. Kennedy tossed out the first ball, the Cardinals' Stan Musial was called to the president's box for a special audience. After the game, Musial was asked about the conversation. Stan said, quote, "I recall to him our last meeting in Milwaukee when he was campaigning in 1960. At that time, he said to me, 'Stan, they say you're too old to be playing baseball, and I'm too young to be running for president, but we'll see.' So, when I met Mr. Kennedy again today, I said to him, 'Mr. President, I guess we're both still doing pretty good,'" unquote. Others in the president's party included Vice President Johnson, Speaker McCormick, and Senators Humphrey, Mansfield, and Symington. In the top of the second, the president shed his jacket, as the temperature had reached 81 degrees. He enjoyed a soft drink during the game and smoked one of his short cigars. As for the game itself, I'll have all the pertinent details later in this broadcast. The United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test yesterday morning over Johnston Island in the Pacific. The detonation, with a 1.4 megaton yield, produced a massive burst of energy called an electromagnetic pulse. The explosion, which took place at an altitude of 250 miles, lit up the night skies for thousands of miles. In Hawaii, about 900 miles from the detonation point, the pulse knocked out 300 streetlights, set off burglar alarms, and damaged a telephone company link, which shut down service from Kauai to the other Hawaiian islands. Residents of Auckland, New Zealand, 3,000 miles southwest of the blast, watched in amazement as an artificial aurora spread a luminous red band across the northern horizon. Yesterday's test was the latest in a series called Operation Dominic. The U.S. scheduled the series as a response to the Soviets' resumption of testing in September of last year. The Soviet test that month broke an informal 3-year moratorium. Negotiation of a treaty banning nuclear tests will resume on Monday in Geneva. The primary obstacle has been acceptance by the Soviets of regular on-site inspections. On Sunday, Secretary of State Dean Rusk was asked about the inspection conundrum.
The Defense Department made public a report yesterday which showed that a series of tests that we've conducted have made some important progress in better detecting underground nuclear explosions. Do you think that these continuing series of experiments, if they prove to be successful, could open up the way for us to reduce the amount of inspection and we believe necessary on Soviet soil?
Well, those tests, of course, have been of very great interest to us in the Department of State and in the Disarmament Agency. But I want to emphasize that so far as we can now tell, it is still not possible to do all of this from long-distance instrumentation. Some control stations and some on-site inspection would in any event be required. Now, so long as the Soviet Union is saying adamantly no control posts and no on-site inspection, then we are still back where we were.
Meanwhile, Soviet Premier Khrushchev has been intensifying his rhetoric regarding nuclear war. On Thursday, regarding a possible surprise attack on the Soviet Union, Mr. Khrushchev said, quote, "We shall not let anyone catch us unawares. We have said and we say again, if they start a war, they shall meet with a shattering retaliation," unquote. At his press conference Thursday, President Kennedy was asked for his assessment of U.S.-Soviet relations at this time.
We continue to attempt to work for an adjustment of those major tensions which disturb the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union and between the free world and the communist world. We have not always been as successful as we had hoped, but we are continuing. We're continuing the discussions over Berlin. We are now in conference in Geneva on Laos. We are going to be back in conference on July 16th on disarmament with the Soviet Union. In a whole variety of ways, we are attempting to lessen the chance of conflict with the Soviet Union and maintain our own security and the peace of the free world. That's the object of our policy, and we are going to attempt to continue to live in peace with all countries, particularly those countries whose military potential is such that any great conflict would involve the future of both of our countries and of the race.
Later in the conference, Mr. Kennedy was asked about the status of the administration's fallout shelter program.
Within the last 10 days, I've sent up a supplemental appropriation request for around $35 million for the distribution of food throughout the country, which would be available in case of an attack. These matters have some rhythm. When the skies are clear, no one is interested. And suddenly then, when the clouds come, and after all, we have no insurance that they will not come, then everyone wonders why more hasn't been done. I think the time to do it is now. Under the program, which we started some months ago, nearly 60 million shelters have been identified. We want to have food in them and other necessities, and I'm hopeful that the Congress will implement the program we've sent out.
Central to the administration's program for 1963 is a $460 million shelter incentive. That money would be used to help schools, hospitals, and other nonprofit organizations build community fallout shelters. A groundbreaking collaboration between private enterprise and the federal government has produced a state-of-the-art communications satellite called Telstar. Telstar, launched this morning aboard a Delta rocket from Cape Canaveral, was developed by AT&T's Bell Laboratories. Upon finishing the satellite, AT&T paid NASA $3 million to launch and track the device. This first-ever privately financed space venture commences the era of ocean-spanning live television. At about 7:20 this evening New York time, the three major networks broke into their evening programs to carry segments of the satellite telecast, viewed simultaneously in the US, France, and Great Britain. In addition to its TV chores, Telstar transmitted news photographs as well as a telephone call from Fred Kappel, AT&T's board chairman, to Vice President Johnson, who was stationed in the Carnegie Institute Auditorium in Washington. At the time of Mr. Kappel's call from Andover, Maine, the satellite was whirling through space, 3,000 miles above the Earth.
Good evening, Mr. Vice President. How do you hear me?
You're coming through nicely, Mr. Kappel.
Well, the teamwork this morning at Cape Canaveral, which I witnessed, was outstanding.
I quite agree, and I think this is a matter of satisfaction for every citizen of the nation. I'm certain that the results of the Telstar tests will be most valuable in providing some of the knowledge needed to bring into operations a very fine commercial communication satellite system.
Numerous NASA and government officials joined the vice president, including Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine.
As a former employee of the telephone company, I am delighted with this inspiring success of the Telstar. But as a member of the Senate Space Committee, I'm even more delighted.
Newton Minow, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, observed today's activities from Andover.
We now have an increased opportunity to improve the flow of information among all nations, to surmount the walls of ignorance and prejudice, and to use mass communications hopefully to avoid mass destruction.
I'll have more news for you after this message.
Hey, Charlie, what's with the dark glasses? I never seen a tuna in dark glasses.
You don't see tunas with cigars every day either.
Oh, come on. What's with the shades?
I'm going up to the surface for a look around. Like the sun hurts my eyes, you know?
Ooh, what's up there?
A star-kissed tuna scout.
A star-kissed tuna scout?
Get it, kid. It'd never make the weight. Besides, it ain't what you are, it's who you know that counts. You gotta have connections.
You got connections?
My brother-in-law, Starkist, took him last month. I'm sure he put in a word for me.
Sorry, Charlie. Only the finest prime tuna is good enough for Starkist. More people like the taste of Starkist than any other tuna. Try it and see why.
Tell him Charlie sent you.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy were jailed today in Albany, Georgia. The two men were convicted of violating a city ordinance last December by leading a demonstration without a permit. Offered the choice of paying $178 fines or spending 45 days in jail, the integration leaders chose incarceration. They are now awaiting assignment to prison work gangs. This afternoon, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller sent a telegram to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy asking federal protection for Dr. King. He also urged the Attorney General to, quote, immediately investigate whether constitutional rights of peaceable assembly have been violated in this case, unquote. Governor Rockefeller is viewed as President Kennedy's most likely opponent in 1964. In October of 1960, the president, then a candidate, intervened on Dr. King's behalf when the minister was jailed on a separate charge. Dr. King publicly expressed his gratitude at that time, and some have attributed Mr. Kennedy's narrow victory that year to the publicity following that incident. In recent months, however, Dr. King has been increasingly critical of what he calls the administration's lack of initiative on civil rights.
President Kennedy has done some significant things in civil rights. But at the same time, I must say that President Kennedy hadn't done enough, and we must remind him that we elected him. But I think the time has come for the President of the United States to sign an executive order outlawing segregation or declaring it unconstitutional.
At a recent meeting with the president, Dr. King stressed the importance of an executive order outlawing discrimination in federal housing. As a candidate in 1960, Mr. Kennedy twice promised to sign such an order.
Most of the housing financing falls under the federal government, either through FHA, PHA, urban renewal, or veterans loans. And as long as there is housing segregation, as I said to the president, we will have segregation in public schools. We will have segregation in recreational facilities and all areas, so that this is a pressing need, and I think it would solve a great problem.
At Thursday's press conference, the president was pressed on the housing issue.
I believe you've been in office about 17 months now and still haven't signed that order against racial segregation in federal financed housing. Could you tell us when you do plan to sign that?
When I will announce it when we think it would be in a useful and appropriate time.
You will sign it before the end of your term.
I've said already that I would meet any commitments of that kind that I've made. Yes. I will point out that we've carried out a great many activities in the field of civil rights, executive action, and including action by the Department of Justice and others, and I will take actions as it appears that they will accomplish the result which we want to accomplish, which is providing equal opportunity. Yes.
At a Pentagon news conference this week, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara expressed optimism about recent developments in South Vietnam. However, he cautioned that a final victory over the communist guerrillas could be years away. To support his optimism, Mr. McNamara cited the ratio of killed and captured, which he claimed was increasingly favorable to the South Vietnamese forces. Mr. McNamara's optimism is not shared by a number of U.S. advisors and observers stationed in South Vietnam, who report that the war is not going well. One problem they cite is poor communication between American advisors and South Vietnamese officials. On Sunday, Secretary of State Dean Rusk said he was aware of these negative reports.
I also recall during World War II that I served from the company commander of infantry all the way to war plans on the general staff, and know that you can get almost any story you want to out of a situation like this. The war in Vietnam is a dirty, a disagreeable war. But the main fact is that the Vietnamese armed forces are on the initiative. They're out aggressively running down these guerrillas. The guerrilla incidents are dropping in number. There has been a considerable improvement in such things as command structure, mobility, supply, intelligence. There always is more to be done. And undoubtedly, this kind of warfare is frustrating for those who are taking part in it, because the enemy is unseen. He strikes without warning or notice. And when you strike back at him, frequently he isn't there. But the important thing is that the South Vietnamese army is taking the initiative, they're reducing the incidents, and I think they're on the move.
A report issued last week by the USSR's government press agency announced that Raul Castro, Cuba's armed forces minister, had arrived in Moscow. Fidel Castro's brother was met at the airport by Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky and other high officials. The Soviet report gave no indication of the length or purpose of Mr. Castro's visit. Meanwhile, a Soviet Tu-114 airliner took off on a survey flight today as part of preparations for regular direct airline service from Moscow to Havana. Opening of the line, expected later this year, will mark the first ever regular flights of Soviet aircraft into the Western Hemisphere. Sports, right after this.
Frank Church is the first Idahoan since Bora to serve on the powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has worked for peace through American strength and for trimming the waste from foreign aid, has saved millions of taxpayers' dollars. Keep Idaho strong. Re-elect Senator Frank Church.
The National League combined timely hitting, speed on the base paths, and first-class pitching today to win the first of 1962's two All-Star games. The final score was 3-1. In the bottom of the first, Dodger Don Drysdale, the National League starter, presented his calling card, Intimidation. The recipient was Minnesota third baseman Dick Rollins, the American League's leadoff man.
Rollins is 24 years of age, and he is hit by a pitch ball. and becomes the American League's first base runner.
With Rollins on first and one away, Drysdale confronted the Yankees' murderous M&M duo. Power against power, the 6'5" right-hander fed both sluggers a steady diet of fastballs. First was Maris.
Del Crandall, the catcher. Don Drysdale, the pitcher. Here is a swing and a miss. He struck him out on an inside pitch.
Next up, Mickey Mantle.
In over 11 previous seasons, he's averaged 34 homers a year. There is a swing and a miss. He struck him out. The ball was dropped by Crandall, picks it up and tags Mantle as he stands there. So Drysdale gets 2 strikeouts here.
In the top of the third, the American League starter, Detroit's Jim Bunning, sent a message of his own when Drysdale came to bat.
2-strike pitch to Drysdale. Almost knocked him down, had him ducking, and he ended up in the dirt. He started to lean back to take him tight across the chest, then buckled at the knees and went down in the dirt. It's 1-2 to Drysdale.
After the game, Bunning issued the usual denial of having deliberately brushed back Drysdale. But when a reporter noted that Bunning was scheduled to hit against Drysdale in the American League's next time at bat, Bunning grinned and said, quote, "Well, I knew I was going out for a pinch hitter," unquote. But the spotlight today belonged to Drysdale's teammate, Maury Wills. The speedy shortstop entered the game in the 6th as a pinch runner for Stan Musial after Musial led off with a single. Wills made his presence felt immediately.
The infield is up a step. Rollins into the edge of the inner grass at third, looking for the bunt. Fastball ready, there goes Wills. The pitch swung on and missed, and batting makes no throw to second base. It's a clean steal by Maury Wills.
After Maury's theft, Pittsburgh's Dick Groat knocked him in for the first National League run, and San Francisco's Orlando Cepeda scored Groat with a sacrifice. After the game, Wills explained the technique behind his larceny, stating, quote, "Everything depends on the getaway. I'm really not that fast. All the bases I steal on the pitcher," unquote. In the top of the 8th, with the Nationals ahead 2-1, it was Maury on the spot once again as he led off the inning.
There's a pop fly into shallow left center field. Coming out in a hurry is Colavito, and he can't get there. The ball dropped. Aparicio picks it up, throws on to second, and Wills holds at first with a Texas League single.
Next up, Giants third baseman Jim Davenport.
Donovan checks Wills, delivers the ground ball through the hole, a base hit to left field. Wills around second, and he'll hold there. Colavito throws in behind the runner. Wills going for third, the throw to third. He is safe at third.
After the game, American League left fielder Rocky Colavito insisted that Wills had been caught at third. Third baseman Brooks Robinson concurred, stating, quote, "I was all over him. I had him. I tagged him high in the leg, but the umpire said he was past me," unquote. In any event, Felipe Alou followed Davenport with a sacrifice fly, scoring Wills for the Nationals' third and final run. Afterward, in the National League clubhouse, players sat in clusters for almost an hour, discussing the high points of the game. Regarding his single that touched off a 2-run rally, 41-year-old Stan Musial said, quote, "Well, these young fellows just needed something to get them started. It was a lot of fun, a great game, and a good team effort," unquote. 71-year-old Casey Stengel worked the coaching line today for the first time in 30 years. Asked if he did much chattering from the first base box, the Mets skipper said, quote, "Well, a few of those Americans that got there, and there weren't very many at that, wanted to know if they could have jobs on our Mets. I told them I thought I just might be able to find places for them," unquote. The Mets currently trail the Dodgers by 31.5 games. Los Angeles maintains a half-game lead over the Giants. In the American League, the Yankees are back in their accustomed spot at the top of the heap. The Indians trail by 1 game, the Angels by 2.5. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Tuesday, July 10th, 1962. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.